Chatterbots. Welcome back to another episode of Chat About That. I'm Bella.
And I'm Malik.
And I'm Monique.
And in this episode, we're going to be chatting about OceanGate and the Titan Submersible. Before we chat about that, I want to formally introduce our guest, Monique. She is the host of a brand new podcast called From Hype to Headlines. Thank you so much, Monique, for joining us today. Will you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
I'm Monique. I'm from the Northern Virginia area, and I love pop culture and celebrity and news. And so I'm really excited to talk about OceanGate with you all today. And if people are interested in those three topics, they should come over at From Hype to Headlines.
Thank you so much. We actually recorded an episode together over on that podcast, which will be out soon. We talked all about Ariana Grande and everything that's going on. So be on the lookout for that episode and stay tuned. In this episode, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about OceanGate and the Titan Submersible tragedy. Before we get into that, we just want to preface that what happened with OceanGate was a tragedy. People lost their lives. We're not here to poke fun or make this into a meme. We will talk all about the social media response and everything later in the episode, but just putting that out there in the beginning, this was a tragedy. People lost their lives. It was a horrible thing that happened. So we're not here to make light of this. I just wanted to chat about this, and I know it's a bit late. It's kind of old news at this point, but more information has come out. Yeah, we just wanted to preface that. So first, we're going to just start off chatting about a little bit of what OceanGate is, because people kind of just think it's this tourism company, but there was a lot more going into it than people were really talking about online. And then we'll get into who those passengers were and the tragedy that unfolded. And then, like I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about the social media reaction. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the founding of OceanGate. So OceanGate is a private tourism expedition underwater diving company. And it was founded back... Yeah. And it was founded back in 2009 by Stockton Rush and Guillermo Solén. And Stockton Rush, he was one of the victims in the Titan Submersible. People were calling him like the CEO because was the CEO of OceanGate, but that name might be familiar to some of you. And he was originally interested in aviation and space travel, and he was actually a commercial pilot for a little bit of time. And his interests moved over to submarines, and his experience with them and research led him to this niche market of underwater ocean tourism, which before OceanGate and all this, I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, did either of you know anything about ocean tourism?
Apart from diving and cruises, no way.
Yeah, it sounds to me just like something that only the uber rich would know about. And, it reminds me of like those stories of them, going on elaborate hunting trips and stuff. Like it really shows you just how privileged everyone was that could be involved in this.
Yeah, we'll get into a little bit about like how it started out and how much money the jump was from its original purpose. And so the other founder, Guillermo, he was actually a United States Marine Corps captain, and he co-founded a speech recognition technology company. And he worked in a bunch of other technology startups before co-founding OceanGate. And when all this was going on, he was on the news and was talking, because obviously he knew Stockton, he worked with him, but he did have some commentary during the time that the submarine was missing. So moving into just what OceanGate was, or what it started off as. So it aimed at creating a fleet of 5-person commercial submersibles for lease by organizations and individuals. So like the Titan Submersible, all of these subs that they have were only able to house 5 people, which is very interesting because when you think, and a submersible is not the same as a submarine.
Well, a submersible would be any kind of a small, very simple craft just to kind of go under the water, come back up. Whereas a submarine has a whole crew of hundreds of personnel, depending on the country, the mission, the type of submarine, the time period, things like that. Whereas they specifically have a mission. And again, that depends on submarine to submarine, But yeah, they're there for a purpose as opposed to, vacation or pleasure.
And I know that submersibles are also used in research as well,
Mm-hmm.
which we'll talk about in a minute. So the first of these were 5-person. So all of the vessels that they have are only meant to house 5 people. It's very exclusive. And they originally called them like antipods, which carried about 130 dives between 2010 and 2013. So this business model originally was having people rent these submersibles out for hire for research purposes or for tourism, for underwater excursions. So they did actually start off working with researchers to, use these vessels for actual like education and research and other like legitimate means, but they also were doing it for tourism. So I think it started out being a little bit more, I don't want to say legit because tourism in general is not illegitimate, but it started off with like a real like concrete purpose other than just for uber rich people.
Yeah, I didn't realize that it was used for research. That's really interesting. And, from what I know of submersibles, at least for the scientific ones, I've heard they're just really small and you can really only fit like maybe 1 or 2 people on there. So to have 5 seems like already you're kind of pushing the limits of safety, at least in my novice opinion.
Yeah, I know there were other people who go down to the Titanic, which we'll talk about later, but for people who work at like NOAA or other like researchers, you're right, those vessels are 1 to 2 people, sometimes not even manned by people at all. They're, just a robot pretty much. And so at this time, so this was between 2010 and 2013, passengers typically paid, get this, between $7,500 to $40,000 per person per excursion. So way less than the cost for the Titan. That's like less than half. It's less than half of what you were paying before.
Yeah, it sounds like just a nice family trip.
Yeah.
Just see the Titanic.
And their first tourism excursion, so not even just like for research purposes, their first actual tourist excursion was in 2010. And it was transporting tourists to the Catalina Island, which is off California. And then they visited a couple other like wreckage sites that were obviously not as deep as the Titanic. But that's what they were doing, was mostly just like underwater tourism. A little bit more about Guillermo, who was the co-founder in 2013. So again, the company was founded in 2009. First excursions were in 2010, and then in 2013, the co-founder Guillermo left OceanGate because it moved away from like its original purpose. He didn't leave on bad terms with Stockton Rush. And like I mentioned, during the time that the Titan was missing, he did express concerns for Stockton, the other passengers, and did talk about his time with the company. So I wanted to mention that. So then 3 years after Guillermo leaves the company, in 2016, they ordered titanium components for a vessel called the Cyclops 2. So they had these antipods, which are the original ones. Then they had another sub called the Cyclops, and then they had a sub called Cyclops 2 in 2016. And then in 2018, the Cyclops 2 was renamed to, can we all guess what it was renamed to? The Titan. So Cyclops 2 became the Titan. And
yeah, Cyclops is not a great like name. I wouldn't call any. No. That's kind of old school. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the name probably comes from the way that the sub looks. So if you've seen the pictures of the Titan, it's like a cylinder looking vessel with some parts sticking out of it, and then the front porthole sort of looks like an eyeball. So I can guess why, if you look on it from like the front, it kind of looks like a cyclops. That's probably where they got the name from. But yeah, I think
they should have called it Mike Wazowski.
Oh no, yeah.
They might have been sued by Disney, but for how much money that it costs to go, they probably could have afforded to get the rights to that. So in 2018, it was renamed to the Titan, and the testing took place from 2018 to 2019.
Which, when you think about it, a year of testing something like this isn't a long time. I mean, it takes decades to come out with new I mean, even boats and aircraft and things like that through rigorous, stress testing and things like that. You think just a year for something that's going, thousands of meters below the surface of the ocean, one of the most inhospitable locations on Earth. It's like only a year, really? Maybe not like 5-10 years. I don't know. Already, that to me is already a red flag. Like that's pretty awful short timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, they're definitely already like the cutting corners is starting to show.
Yeah.
The little red flags.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I completely agree. So in 2021, they begin their missions to the Titanic in the Titan. So only like 3 years in between finishing testing and going down to one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. And like you said, it does not seem like a whole lot of time for testing. And so the Titan was actually not the first of the subs that went down to the Titanic. So they had other vessels prior to creating the Titan that went down. But basically in 2022, the price for taking a trip with OceanGate down to the Titanic cost $250,000 per person, which is more than double what the original price tag was. If you're capping it at the 40K, that's more than double what their original cost was. So was that because they're, more of an established company? Is that because the company wants more money? I don't know. I'm not a business person.
I'm convinced math is not real. I mean, because I feel like companies do this all the time and just hike up these prices and then expect the rich to come out of the woodwork and just buy it. And sometimes it works, but my theory is still that numbers are just imaginary.
Numbers that big, I have to imagine them. Oh my God.
I mean, and even when you look at the original business model of the company, yes, it was for tourism. That was always a thing, but it was also for researchers. The fact that it went in pretty much like a decade, not even from its original like purpose and idea, only being able to cater to the super rich. It's very interesting. But I mean, also going down to not super far depths in the ocean is different than going all the way down to the Titanic. So obviously, like the cost behind that is probably going to be more, but I just think it's interesting. Getting into a little bit what we're talking about with cutting corners, Stockton Rush was warned against using carbon fiber materials to create the submersibles. And he was warned by experts in the field. So it wasn't just like random people that he knew. These were experts in the field of underwater exploration. So in 2018, basically when the Titan was first being developed, he was criticized for not testing the ship. And this led to a lot of concerns about the design and safety. So again, these concerns were being raised by not only the employees of the company, but other people in this field who were warning him against using specific materials. Because the depth that you have to go down to get to the Titanic is really far down in the ocean. And if you're not using the proper materials and, creating vessels with, they're able to withstand that, things like the Titan are going to happen.
So this is just what I heard on CNN, but when James Cameron was talking about his expeditions and the Titan itself, he was explaining that, there's the opportunity for little micro particles of water to get into the carbon fiber and it just over time it can cause wear and tear. So it's really interesting. The guy just decided, okay, this is what I'm going to go with, and I'm going to die on this hill. I mean, I don't know if I should have said that, but we'll keep it in there.
I mean, and even like a lot of the materials, not just like the carbon fiber, but like we all know, if you followed the story, the vessel was controlled with an Xbox controller that had like a reputation. The specific controller that he used had a reputation for not working properly. The lights that were in the sub were like from Outdoor World, which like no shade Outdoor World. They did not ask to be brought into this narrative, but like he's using camping lights, which camping lights are maybe not designed to be used in a a submarine that's going to go down into, super far depths in the ocean. So it seems like there's just a lot of cutting corners, and the fact that people were warning him, like not just the employees, but like, other people that are in this field, like, because I think when you think about like a company like this, when someone comes up with a great idea, which at the end of the day, like, this is not a terrible idea, like to do underwater tourism like this. I mean, maybe not down to the Titanic, but in general, like vessels like this, they're not a bad idea. He's not the first person who came up with these. But when people are telling you, hey, maybe you should look at this kind of material, or hey, that doesn't really work, like, why don't you use this? Like, people, it didn't seem like people were trying to like stop him from his vision. It seemed like people were trying to be like, hey, there's some problems here.
Yeah, and I think I come from a fire and rescue background, and I just think about safety as being our number one concern. And his concern was, it seemed, more either to make money or bring people down to see how cool his little ship was. And it really is unfortunate that it went down the way it did. Yeah, I just think safety was not his concern, and it's clear just based on the choices he made.
You think some of the money aspect, if he's raking in $250,000 per ticket, I think they could afford, better control system, better lighting system, better materials, things like where's that money going? Like, I mean, even to the extent of like, the testing aspect of it. Okay, is that money going in toward, okay, every 5 dives, we're going to stress test the thing, we're going to pull it, and we're going to run it through routine inspections, things like that.
He was so obsessed. In the interviews I saw, he was just so obsessed with the design, and have like just the fact that it was just this cylindrical tube and made of polycarbon fiber, and just to think that, okay, this alone is going to hold up under that much gravity and pressure underwater is insane to me. I don't know how someone could literally look at that and say, yeah, that's a great idea, let's put it together and send $1 million worth of people down there.
Yeah.
So with the concerns around the design and safety, prior to the Titan disaster, various employees of OceanGate also expressed concerns about the ship's structure, and some of them actually filed a lawsuit against OceanGate. Then in 2019, Stockton published a blog post explaining all about why they didn't get their vessel classified, and there was all just this mumbo jumbo about why it wasn't getting it like certified and classified and all that. And he claimed in this blog post that most of the accidents that happen result from operator error rather than mechanical failure, which I'm not a scientist, but I feel like that I don't know if that's accurate.
I've heard people say that about planes, but when it comes to planes, like that's a proven field. Like this unexplored area, like Malik was saying earlier, it needs way more testing and way more experimentation, which is the same as testing, but it needs more of that. Otherwise, you're really risking the lives of people that you're sending down there.
Yeah. And I remember another person who I think they're a researcher with NOAA or some other legitimate researcher. This man said that he went down, I think it was with NOAA, went down to the Titanic for research purposes on like a routine trip. And this was like a legitimate vessel, like a classified vessel, and they lost communications with the people above. They were trapped under the water. I think they got like stuck on some part of like the Titanic, because like the Titanic, for those of you who don't know, is broken into 2 sections, and this will come in later. The one part of the ship is on one end of the ocean, and then there's like a couple feet in between, and then the other part. So this person who was going down on this legitimate research trip, they got like caught, like their vessel got caught in a part of the Titanic, and they were stuck down there for like 5 hours, and he thought he was going to die. And this was like a legitimate vessel, a legitimate trip that he was on. And other people who have been down there from legitimate means, and I hate to say that OceanGate's not legitimate, but you know what we're getting at, like, real research vessels have lost communication, have gotten caught. So even with things just like planes, like, yes, there are some some airline companies are a little sketchy, and then there's the ones that are more people trust more, but even the ones that people trust more can have problems. So the fact that there were all these people telling him, look, you need to like up the quality, it's just kind of unfortunate. And there's another journalist who actually participated in an OceanGate excursion in 2022, so last year. He went down, well, he attempted to go down to the Titanic with the Titan for, journalistic purposes. He said that the Titan was not equipped with an emergency locator beacon, leading to a 5-hour time period where they were not being tracked by the operators on the surface. So again, like the other trip that was done by researchers also lost communications, but that one was like a certified vessel, and then this one is also losing power. And then there were a bunch of other stories. I would love to talk about all of them, but there were many other stories of people who attempted to go on OceanGate excursions, and many of them did actually happen. Like they did actually have successful dives to the Titanic, but many of them experienced issues. There's a lot of background, and I know we haven't really gone to the Titan yet, but this is all important. And I think that this is a kind of a narrative that should be reiterated when we talk about this tragedy. So a little bit more about safety. So the Titan operated in international waters and was not subject to safety regulations. So maybe that was a reason. And so passengers entering the Titan have to sign a waiver confirming their knowledge that this is an experimental vessel and that it has not been approved or certified by any regulatory body.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine the fact he was in international waters is probably what helped him get away with this for so long. I mean, if he was offshore anywhere like in US, I mean, he'd be shut down immediately. And it just makes you wonder if there's other operations like this out there.
In 2022, Stockton Rush claimed to have broken some rules to make the Titan. So clear, we all know that. Like, come on. And OceanGate, the company, claimed that the Titan was the only crewed submersible in the world that used RTM, which is real-time monitoring system. And then this system allegedly provided early warning signs of problems and allowed time to abort the descent and return to the surface. Okay, so now we're finally getting to the tragedy. I do want to mention the passengers. So Stockton Rush, so one passenger, he's the CEO and co-founder of OceanGate, like we mentioned. Shahzada Dawood, who's a Pakistani-British businessman. Suleiman, who was 19. And then Hamish Harding, who is a British businessman, an aviator, and a space tourist. And then Paul Henry Nargile, who's a former French Navy commander, a diver, a submersible pilot, and a member of the French Institute for Research and Exploitation of the Sea. Basically, we had a mixed bag of people on this. So obviously the CEO, and I will mention that Stockton Rush did go on, I think he went on all of these excursions, if not the majority of them. So it wasn't like he was just sending people down there by themselves. Like he was the one that was manning these. And then Shahzada and his son, I think people kind of remember them a lot. So his son, Suleiman, who was only 19, apparently this was what his mother or his aunt or his mother told the news, was that apparently he really didn't want to go on this trip. He only went on it because when the Titan descended, it was on Father's Day, and his father asked him to go on this with him. And he apparently expressed like that he was terrified to go on this. He did not want to do it. His father, like he was doing it to make him happy and to do it for Father's Day. And so like he, in my mind, he didn't really have a choice, or he was like, he felt obligated to do that. So that's just like horribly sad. Like when I heard about that, because originally when I heard about it, it was like a man and his son were on it. And I was like, so it's just like a father-son duo going on like a little trip to the Titanic. But apparently like he didn't even want to go on it, which is so horrible. So like the last moments of his life, he was just in terror. Like that's just so like that. Out of everything, like that makes me like so sad.
That story alone, it just kind of shows you the human cost of this, and just, I mean, who can't relate to trying to do something nice for a parent, So it really kind of pulls at the heartstrings.
And then apparently there was somebody else who was supposed to go on this, but they backed out when they read the waiver because they were like, this is a little sketchy. So I just wanted to mention who the passengers were. So the dive began on June 18th, 2023. And during the first hour and a half of the descent, the Titan was communicating with the Polar Prince, which is the surface command that helps monitor like the dive and everything. So they were communicating with them every 15 minutes. So they had like a little computer on inside the Titan that they could chat into, and it would send a signal up to the Polar Prince. And so every 15 minutes they were saying, hey, this is how it's going, and all that. And so about 2 hours after the dive began, all communication stopped. And this was possibly due to the early warning system like failing. And then the submersible was expected to resurface at 4:30, so they began their descent, I think, around 11 or so. They're supposed to begin ascending at 4:30. And so the U.S. Coast Guard was notified by, I guess, the Polar Prince that they were missing. And then the Navy was reviewing its acoustic data, and they were passing information to the Coast Guard about a possible implosion event because they heard some stuff on like a sonar. And to top it all that, the Titan vessel only has 96 hours of breathable oxygen inside the vessel. So the one thing, we're going to talk about the social media coverage and everything, but the one thing that made me like so mad about the coverage, I don't remember what news station it was, but one of the news stations literally had a timer on the screen that said like countdown to how much time their oxygen runs out. Like it was like the Hunger Games or something. Like I get covering this because it's news, it's a thing in the moment, you got to be on top of that kind of stuff. But having like a countdown to how long people have to live is like really sick. Like that's like Hunger Games level disgusting to me.
Yeah, that's pretty tough.
It was so weird looking back at it. I mean, now we can say that, and just kind of I remember the days being like, oh no, they only have a day left, and just thinking like there was still a chance. That's what was kind of the saddest part about it.
Yeah, and I don't know, I just the fact that the news like took that like ran with it and was like, let's all count down to how long they have to live. Like it's I can only compare it to the Hunger Games because like it was like watching some sort of spectacle. Like this isn't a spectacle, this isn't like a game, this is people's lives. So the search and rescue efforts began, and they were led by the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Canadian Coast Guard. And so the U.S. Coast Guard described the mission as when they were beginning this rescue, they said it was going to be really difficult because of how remote the location was, the weather, because at the time the weather was terrible in that part of the world, the darkness of the sea, the overall sea conditions, and the temperature of the water. So everything was going against the Coast Guard to even like do this search because of all these horrible factors going into it. And an internal U.S. government memo revealed that there were underwater noises being picked up by a Canadian sonar. So also like when all of this coverage was going on, there were things that were, picked up by sonar, and the Navy was hearing things and all of that. And a lot of this information was like, oh, well, 2 days ago, the Navy heard whatever. And a lot of people were like mad. They're like, well, why didn't the Navy say anything?
All I'll say about it is, people were getting mad. Oh, if the Navy and Coast Guard knew about this, a couple days ago, why didn't they tell us? Well, one of the big reasons why information is classified is not the information itself, is how we got it. And so, this was such a worldwide story. Everybody was looking. If the Navy or Coast Guard suddenly published this information, then other actors, good, bad, whomever, could pinpoint certain capabilities of our technology, or where we have certain vessels, things like that. So again, it's this ship is blue. Well, that information isn't necessarily classified, but how do we know that ship is blue? It just is kind of a stupid example.
So yeah, so there were noises being picked up, and the source of the noise at the time was unknown, but people were saying, oh, it's them banging on the ship. And then some people were like, no, it's just debris in the water. But then the Coast Guard later said that the noises were unrelated to the Titan. So there's so much in the ocean, and especially around the Titanic, with how much debris is still there. The majority, I would say like 99% of the wreckage of the Titanic is still in the water. There are things that they have taken to the surface, but the majority of the Titanic is still there. So there's so much going on. There's so much debris. A lot of it is like falling apart. And so if they did pick up any noises, it was probably just debris moving around. So
when you think about it too, if, you have half a dozen ships on the surface searching for this, ships are very, very loud. So, any kind of, propulsion systems, things in the hull, just creaks and groans from the hull being battered by waves, all that makes noise. So all these systems are picking up all these other ships in the water, just further making the rescue efforts even more difficult.
So at that time, when the noises were being heard, the Coast Guard stated that this mission was a search and rescue mission rather than like a wreckage recovery mission. I think the rescuers knew that it was very unlikely that they were alive. So on June 22nd, which is just a couple days after, which when looking back on it, this seemed like this was going on for like months. This was like 3 or 4 days. Felt like it. Yeah, it felt like it was like 2 months that this was going on, but no, this was just a couple of days. So on June 22nd, the Coast Guard announced that they found a debris field near the Titanic wreck, and it was confirmed that it was a part of the submersible. So the loss of the submersible was due to an implosion of the pressure chamber. Pieces of the Titan were found at the seafloor about 1,600 feet northeast of the bow of the Titanic. So during this whole time, people had theories as to what they think happened. Some people thought that they were still alive. A lot of people thought that the implosion happened. A lot of people were guessing when the implosion happened. A lot of them were guessing, I think they're still alive. But when I was listening to a lot of these interviews from people who were either researchers or people who had been to the Titanic, like James Cameron, the majority of those interviews, people were asked, do you think there's a possibility that these people are alive? And pretty much every single person that was asked that question, they said no, just given everything that was going on.
There was no doubt in my mind that there was something that it wasn't going to end well. I mean, having something that far deep and desolate, I mean, they were talking about getting a crane and lifting some things out, and it just seemed too far-fetched, and unfortunately it was.
So the debris field was concentrated into 2 areas. So the aft end bell, I'm not versed with ships and stuff, but is that like the back of the ship? Okay, so the back of the ship was separated from the front end. So I guess that makes sense with an implosion, that would have collapsed in on itself and then the debris would have been pushed out. So the Coast Guard said that the way that the debris was scattered, it was consistent with a catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. So basically an implosion. And then the Coast Guard's response was that the environment was incredibly unforgiving and that the bodies of those on board would not be recovered. So again, with a lot of this like coverage online, people were like, well, what happens to their bodies? Like, can any of their bodies be recovered? And just the way of like how quick an implosion is, and especially like when you're that far underwater, if there was even if there wasn't an implosion, if just a hole was like, there was just a hole in the vessel, the amount of pressure that is under that far in the ocean, under the water, like water, even a tiny little bit of water coming in would like slice you like a knife would. So even if there was just a tiny little hole and they didn't even implode, like anyone standing near that water would just be like sliced. So even if they did run out of oxygen and the Coast Guard found the Titan like at the bottom of the ocean, was able to recover it, and it didn't implode and all of that, maybe their bodies would have been intact. But the fact that, what actually happened, that it imploded, there was no human remains like at all.
Well, and they just don't send people down that far usually. So like there wouldn't be any machine that could pull it out of the water.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem, Malik's nodding. So I just don't think, in my amateur opinion, that they would be able to find anything down there.
So a day later, on June 23rd, the wreckage recovery was beginning. And then on June 28th, so a couple days after that, recovered remains of the Titan returned to the surface. The debris showed intact titanium covers. The viewport was missing. I think they were able to recover some of the tail cone, some of the electronics, some framing, and some other debris. And that the Coast Guard confirmed presumed human remains, and American medical professionals were called to conduct an analysis. So there might have been like, this is horrible, but like pieces of human flesh inside of the debris, but there's no like an arm or like a finger or something. It's just like probably microscopic pieces of flesh.
Either microscopic pieces of flesh or maybe, metal tooth caps, dental work, any kind of like metal in your body from a surgery or things like that. Or maybe really hard parts like teeth.
Yeah, and with that level of implosion, just you're not going to find an intact body, unfortunately.
No.
But I mean, even animals that are, have evolved to exist in that ecosystem, like deep sea fish, a vessel will be down there checking these fish out at the bottom of the ocean. They're swimming around. They look like normal fish. Then we bring them to the surface and they look like a blob of jelly. I mean, even animals that are meant to live there, even when we change the pressure on them, they completely change. They're just the qualities of their physicality. So imagine us doing the opposite.
Yeah.
Yes.
So then 2 days later, on June 30th, recovery photos were analyzed, and it was concluded that carbon fiber hull failure was most likely the cause of the implosion. And another possible cause was the acrylic viewing window, which was absent from the debris. So one of my theories, like while this was all going on, was that the viewport was the cause of the implosion or, whatever catastrophe, because the type of material that he used for the viewport, which also was incredibly small, and apparently they had to like look at, basically they weren't really looking through the viewport, they were looking at a screen. So it's not even like you're going down to the Titanic and you're all looking out like a window. Like they had a tiny window, but like what they're really looking at is on like a screen. So you could have just watched it like on Zoom or something at that point. But one of my theories was that the material caused the implosion because the like amount of pressure that type of material could handle was like only like halfway down to the Titanic. Like there was literally no way that the pressure that they were under was that was able to withstand it. So that was like part of my theory. So there's those two theories. I don't think they like have anything concrete, and I don't think we'll ever know, but it definitely like was due to the materials that were being used. And to Monique's point earlier that I didn't really think about was, yeah, like if they kept using the same vessel, like this is the Titan, like they only had one of them, over time, the material would start to erode. So I think that's an interesting point that you brought up before, because like, yes, this vessel was successful in some dives, but maybe it just run its course because of the way the materials were used, which I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I'm on the James Cameron theory of that it was microparticles, just because it sounds smart too.
I like that. I do trust James Cameron. Actually, with that, some of the reactions, Sean Leet, who's the co-founder and chair of Horizon Maritime Services, praised the swift responses from the U.S. Coast Guard and other military efforts. So he thought that they did a really good job. And then going back to Monique, James Cameron, who was the director of the Titanic movie, who also, like we mentioned earlier, has made many, many, many trips to the Titanic. And he worked with NOAA, I believe. Yes, he's a director, but he also like has a real attachment to the Titanic. And his trips to the Titanic actually helped like with the creation of the film and like the props and everything. And he's a very smart person. He knows what he's talking about. So he actually, like Monique mentioned, criticized the carbon fiber composite construction and the pressure, and he was criticized the real-time monitoring system that they used. And he also said that the submersible's hull has an inadequate, it's basically just inadequate. He expressed regret for not being more outspoken about the concerns before this accident. And he criticized the false hopes that were being presented to the victims' families by either the military or the media.
I think James Cameron makes some good points, and especially that looking at how he approaches submersibles, I mean, he takes them very seriously and he goes through the proper channels. And just to juxtapose that to Stockton Rush, it makes Stockton Rush look like he was playing fast and loose. I have to commend James Cameron for at least his professionalism in this, because he takes it very seriously and understands the science behind it too. So it's too bad Stockton Rush wasn't more cautious.
Yeah, and there were a lot of people that were interviewed who were, researchers or, scientists or people like James Cameron, that express just like how wild this whole situation was, and the fact that, this company was obviously cutting corners and all of that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just, there was just so much going into this. So in addition to researchers and journalists talking about this during the time when the Titan was missing, social media was ablaze, like we mentioned. And this whole incident became widely discussed as the story was developing, which inspired a lot of darkly humorous internet memes, videos, and interactive video games were recreating the sub, like, while this, like, before we even knew if they were dead, like, mods were coming out for, like, Grand Theft Auto and, like, other games with, like, this hub, and if you, like, went down too far into the ocean, like, it would blow up, and, like, just horrible. Yeah, like horrible, like, mods like that. So, like, in video games, yeah, it was not just memes and people making fun of this, but like people were actually like going to the effort of like making mods for video games. And then OceanGate, they, people were just criticizing OceanGate's poor safety record. People were also saying that they had no empathy for the victims, which also kind of plays into this video that I saw on TikTok that explained the psychology of why people didn't seem to care about this. And this video I saw like recently is basically the way that psychology and kind of how we, what our empathy is that the more closely you can relate to another person, whether it's like in your community or, people you work with, like the more close you are with somebody, the more empathy you have for them. And so the average person in the general public is not a billionaire. The billionaires, that's why they're called the 1%, because the majority of people are not that rich. So the more far removed we are from being able to relate to these people, the less we care about them in a sense. So that makes sense. And I literally saw that video like last week, and it made sense to me. And it's kind of sad on one end that like, oh, the average person doesn't care about billionaires, but like we don't relate to them. So we have a hard time having empathy for them.
Yeah. And, it kind of goes the opposite direction too when it comes to wealth. And, we heard about the 750 migrants going missing or their boat capsizing.
Yeah.
And so few people unfortunately cared because they couldn't relate. And I don't want to give them a pass, but it's just interesting how the closer we think we are to somebody, like the more we seem to care, which I think is something humans should work on.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too. I mean, that was happening within days of all this, the news media coverage of OceanGate. I did see some people mentioning like, oh, why are we focusing on, 5 bajillionaires and not the 500, 600, 700 people who just capsized? I was just about to say, we can't relate to the 1% of the super wealthy, but then a lot of people too can't relate to the 1% of the very, poor, impoverished. I mean, desperate people, fleeing a country to immigrate to another one. I mean, that's something, a lot of the folks watching and maybe memeing also couldn't relate to. It's like, how do you, when the shoe's on the other foot, it's like, how do you think the family members of those, those 4 migrants felt? They're like, where's the outcry over this? Like we just lost all these people. It is interesting just to show, I mean, for lack of better terms, I guess the different like layers of disconnect people have from different groups of different people. It's very telling, I think.
Yeah, and apparently Barack Obama was like really trying to get the media and people to care about the migrants, and said it was just sort of a shame that that whole story was blown over, because I didn't hear like nearly anything about that story. I remember you mentioned it to me, and then I saw like a news article like on Twitter or something, and then there was maybe like 1 or 2 videos on TikTok that I saw about it, but I would say like 99% of the media coverage in just those couple of days was about OceanGate. And even now, we're still talking about OceanGate and we're not giving enough attention to the migrants. So I did want to make sure that we did touch on that in this episode, because that did happen during that time. And that was also a tragedy. And, you know, way more people lost their lives on with that tragedy as well.
And this also isn't the kind of memeing and things like that isn't a new phenomenon. Also,
No.
you know, I saw a post on social media, therefore I'm an expert. But people were kind of, you know, to play devil's advocate, you know, everybody's mad at everybody for memeing on, you know, OceanGate and everything. Then they're like, this wasn't a new thing. And people were actually sharing posts from newspaper clippings back in, you know, the Titanic's day, when the Titanic was discovered and reached, you know, the news media back then, the newspapers, that the Titanic sunk. And basically the gist of these articles was like, oh, this ship claimed to be unsinkable,
Yeah.
too bad, you know, like old school memes, for lack of better terms. I
Yeah.
mean, it's human nature, unfortunately. This isn't a new phenomenon.
So, like, we are criticizing them. A lot of these memes were criticized by you know, people online, journalists, criticize these memes for being insensitive. Going back to psychology, there's a psychologist named Pamela. She's an American expert in social media and mass media. She stated that the Titan incident was widely treated on social media as entertainment. And key elements included the allure of disasters, fascination with the wealthy, conspiracy theories, the uncertainty, and the mythology surrounding the Titanic, as well as the romance of the rescue operations. She said that the trend displayed a lack of accountability and empathy. So I think there's a lot going into it, and people just didn't seem to have empathy or care because they can't relate to it. I think that goes back to like with the migrants, like I think more people could relate to that because there's so many immigrants in the world. I think that kind of story is a little bit more relatable to people, and you know, for how many people were aboard that, and those people were just trying to travel and, you know, make their lives better, and they were ended up losing their lives over it, versus people who were just going on a trip for fun. So there's more empathy for those people.
What's interesting is that, you know, the Titan and the Titanic they kind of run along the same parallel, and just, it's a sad story. I mean, the Titanic is even worse because there were people from all walks of life on there, but it was also catering to the wealthy. So you have the Titanic disaster and the Titan disaster literally mirroring each other in that sense.
And what's interesting though is like the majority of the people on the Titanic who died were actually the lower class people, because the upper deck was, so the way that the Titanic was built was the upper deck was like the rich people, and then there's the middle class and then lower class. So the majority of the people who were rescued were actually upper class passengers. And then the majority of the ones who died were actually lower class passengers. Which also kind of mirrors like the migrants who passed away. Like it's kind of all like kind of eerie. And then also apparently Stockton Rush's wife is like related to somebody who was on the Titanic. So people said maybe his like fascination was stemmed from that because of his wife, which I thought was kind of interesting. So moving on, another reason why I'm kind of glad we waited to do this episode was because recently, in the past like couple of days actually, remember when we mentioned the co-founder Guillermo Solen? He is currently leading efforts, guess what, to send people to Venus. This is legitimate.
Oh my gosh.
He said in an interview with Insider that he is aiming to host a colony of 1,000 humans on Venus. He stated that new findings by NASA suggested that humans could potentially live in a small part of the atmosphere on Venus, which is around 30 miles from the surface of the planet. However, just like the ocean, Venus actually has a very toxic atmosphere that's filled with carbon dioxide. And according to NASA, the planet is permanently shrouded in thick yellowish clouds of sulfuric acid that trap heat, causing a runaway greenhouse effect. So just like the bottom of the ocean, it's not looking good for people. However, Guillermo argues that this barrier can be overcome with innovation. And he says that if a space station could be designed to withstand the sulfuric acid in the clouds, hundreds of people could someday live on the atmosphere of Venus. So I will state, on one hand, this is absolutely insane, but on the other hand, he is saying that if this could happen, then we could do it. I feel like he's being like, this is an idea right now. He's not actually like testing anything right now. But I think, I don't know. And there's more to the article, and I didn't write everything down. I don't know if this will ever happen, but it seems like, maybe he's trying to work on innovation around how to, be able to live in an atmosphere like this. So I don't know. I'm interested to kind of follow this and see if he gives up on it or if he begins testing someday. But yeah, this is in the idea stages right now. But what do we think of this?
I'm just not going to sign up.
No, me neither. Yeah, I won't be rich enough to sign up.
But yeah, I mean, this is apparently only going to be 1,000 people. He's just leading the efforts right now. I don't even think they're testing anything, but based on like the whole article, it seemed like he was interested in doing a lot more research than Stockton did on the Titan. So we will see if in a couple of years or if ever that is possible to live on Venus. But yeah, it just seems like, one interesting idea after the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's awful and a tragedy as it is. Hopefully, if we've gotten anything from the Titan tragedy, it's that more testing and more research and more time will be taken to make sure these ideas are sound before putting human lives in the line.
No, I agree. And I would think anyone associated with OceanGate should probably take a break from exploration of any kind, but that's just me.
Apparently, and this might have just been an internet rumor, but maybe one of you heard this, but apparently shortly after the news of the implosion, the website was like updated with like a job description, potentially trying to fill for Stockton Rush or some other jobs. But the company's still a thing. It hasn't gone under. As of right now, there are no lawsuits going on against OceanGate because of how ironclad the waiver was. But I did read that there are like some things the family could sue against. It had to have been like very specific things, and they'd have to prove it. So it would not surprise me if the families right now are working with lawyers like to see if they can sue. And I would not be surprised if in a couple of months or maybe a year from now, somebody finds a way to sue this company, because if there is a way, those families are going to do that, especially for how before we end the episode, I do want to also mention that the stepson of one of the victims during the tragedy posted that he was at like a Blink-182 concert and made this whole post about how I know my stepdad is missing, but I'm enjoying life, and basically sorry you're in the bottom of the ocean, but I'm gonna go to my concert anyway. So that kind of also fueled the fire of we don't give a crap. Why should we care if his stepson doesn't even care? Which honestly, dude, go to your concert. You probably paid, maybe you didn't pay for it because you're rich, but you got tickets to a concert. I get it, but maybe don't post about it on social media. So I think even the fact that the family member, and this is not all the family members, that was just the one guy, but the family member of one of the people didn't even seem to care. So why would the general public? So that kind of just fed into this this narrative of we just don't care. So I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that guy showed no empathy, and he came back, I think, and said something about how worried he was, and it was just a way for him to get his mind off of things. But all I know is that, if someone in my family was missing, I would not be going to any concerts.
Which I think, I mean, it just kind of all goes back to how people just did not have empathy for them. And at the end of the day, yeah, this was a horrible, horrible tragedy. And I'm hoping that OceanGate just learns from this and maybe doesn't, if they're going to redo the Titan, maybe actually get it certified. But I really hope that an incident like this does not happen again. And if Guillermo is really serious about sending people to Venus, which kind of seems like a cool idea, I really hope that he goes through the proper channels and really tries to work on how if he's saying that innovation can happen, listen to people, use like Stockton's mistakes as a guiding point, you know, and I say this to any inventor or any person who has like a grand idea like this, like listen to people who are giving you critiques. Just because someone is criticizing you does not necessarily mean that you should ignore it or that your idea is bad. Like, but listen to like professionals and take criticism to heart and use that criticism as a way to like better your idea or your company or whatever. So that is it for this episode. I hope you learned a bit more about the background of OceanGate, and maybe there's some information about the Titan or the tragedy that you were not aware of. And I hope that this inspires you to make better decisions and to also take criticisms to heart, listen to researchers, listen to people who are giving you feedback, and hopefully a disaster like this does not happen again in the future. I want to say thank you again to Monique for taking time to chat with us today about OceanGate. Like I mentioned earlier, she has a podcast called From Hype to Headlines. I will be featured on the first episode. Again, we are talking about Ariana Grande. So please stay tuned for that episode. I'm very excited to see that and to see where your podcast goes in the future. As always, stay safe, stay classy, and we'll chat again with you soon. Goodbye.
See ya.